It's good to be with you, all of you. Most of the stuff that I deal with is a lot of the time is internal activities in Israel, and internal issues are pretty much tough with the disease and internal politics. We're going towards the fourth elections in a short time, and that's a pretty chaotic situation. The good news for Israel, to be honest, is what I'm speaking about tonight. This feeling of not being alone. I'll just say a few words about that, and then we'll start with the program. From 1948 onwards, one of the problems that Israel faced was the Arab embargo. And it was a very broad embargo. In fact, almost all the Arab countries were involved. And so what we had to do, because of the Arab embargo and there were restrictions, there were problems going through the Suez Canal and many other issues, which I won't go into now. But we really had to work out new mechanisms of getting supplies to Israel and for our products being sent out. So we had to be involved with a whole lot of underhand issues, under the table issues, which Israel is actually quite good at. So we managed to get by those years, but it was never very comfortable. Then we had problems from the 1960s, late 60s onwards with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union tried to push all their member states to boycott us. So that was an issue. However, pretty much at the same time, the United States came to our side. It's really in 1967 that we see a very, very positive approach by the United States. And it's just, to be honest, I don't really know what we would have done as a country without American aid initially, early on in Harry Truman, with the creation of the state, and certainly from 1967 onwards, where the support of America has been tremendous. And in a sense, what I'll be speaking about this afternoon is very much to bring America into the story, because it's been a combined story, albeit with the former administration. We hope with this administration it will carry on in the same way, in one form or the other. Each administration behaves in its own way, and that's totally legitimate. But I think that what I will be saying is that those of us in Israel at the moment, when we look at our global position, it's really very good. We're feeling very different. It's not our best time, and I'll try to relate to that as we go along. So we've got a set of about 16 slides, by the way, for those of you who know me, and hopefully many of those people who I do know are watching this afternoon. I do have my email address at the bottom of the slides, as you'll see. And I welcome you to write to me at any time you want. We'll try and deal with some questions with the chat. But if you do have any questions afterwards, you're absolutely welcome to write to me. And I've been giving quite a lot of Zoom sessions in the last few months. And I absolutely welcome any questions. Any questions, if you're interested in material or anything else, please do write to me. I had such a wonderful month in Irvine last year. I feel I owe all of you more than you can possibly imagine. So let's try and just get a handle on some of the issues. The big picture, just on the left-hand side, you'll just see the points here, just some very, very general points of the Middle East at the moment in the broad picture. Firstly, it's always been the case. The Middle East is such a central part of the world. In the old imperial days, the British were very interested in us because this was the way to go from England, from Britain to India. And the whole situation, the Holy Land environment, the strategic issues, later on, from 1945 onwards, at least the oil importance of the Middle East made this area very important. And as in the past, but maybe even more so now, is the international involvement of it, the countries that I mentioned there, United States, France, United Kingdom, Russia, China, and others as well. What's the internal structure of the Middle East? Firstly, it's divided between Arab and non-Arab states. We are obviously one of the non-Arab states. It's an area of a Sunni majority and a Shi'i minority, which is vitally important at the moment. There's the tremendous gaps between rich and poor, Qatar being the richest and poorest is southern Sudan. Civil wars, fortunately, they've gone down a little bit. The civil wars are one kind or the other in Morocco. We'll be talking about that later. Yemen and Saudi Arabia and internal Yemen issues is there. In the last 3 months, a civil war in Ethiopia. Fortunately, in some areas like Libya, the position has improved. Deep internal tensions in most countries, tribal societies, and tremendous disappointment with the failure of the 2011 Arab Spring. We've got a picture there, which is an interesting picture because, as you people know better than I do, Donald Trump was not particularly favorable to Muslims with some of his immigration legislation. But there he is in 2017 at an important moment. Once again, Arab countries, even those who are very annoyed with his attitude to some of the Muslim countries in terms of immigration, recognize the importance of the United States. To just take some of my own understandings of what's going on, it's essentially there's the global players sometimes make this area an unstable region, but I'm pretty convinced that Israel's importance is that it is seen as a stable country. Israel, with all its internal political tensions, in terms of the Middle East, has been consistently similar over the years. Israel's importance as being the Temple Mount, the third most important site in Islam, is clearly vital. A factor which deeply influences the Sunni majority is that Israel is against the Shiites, Iran, Hezbollah, and the Shiite minorities in other countries. So we are on the side of the majority of Sunni countries. The lack of trust between Arab states means that they want friends. They don't like us in all realms. We'll look at that later. But pretty much, if we're a friendly country, a strong Israel, strong military, excellent economy, startup nation concepts make it a required country. In addition to which, it's very interesting, Israel at the moment is a very conservative, right-wing country. As far as many of the Arab governments are concerned, that's good. They're not looking for leftist, liberal democracies. And because Israel is seen as a conservative country with the influence of religious forces, right-wing religious forces, in many countries that is considered a positive idea. Not my own idea, but that's what they feel. A point about the Palestinians I want to deal with more detail later, but the Palestinian status in the Middle East at the moment is so bad, and they're so unimpressed with them. By the way that Palestinians have played their politics recently didn't work in their favor. So what should normally be a very important agenda item in terms of our contact with Arab countries, the fact that the Palestinian leaders have not played the political game cleverly, my perspective at least, they would obviously disagree with me, means that the other Arab countries find it easier to deal with this. The world is, as we know, is increasingly pragmatic and less ideological. Israel is seen as a pragmatic society. And my very last comment here on the bottom in the bold, I think is a very important issue which is often forgotten. And that is that our high point in terms of international relations in the world, in the Arab world and other countries, was after the Oslo Accords, 1993, 1995, a very dramatic and somewhat seen in some people's minds as excessively adventurous, were the Oslo Accords with the late Yitzhak Rabin and the late Shimon Peres being the central players. The tragedy of Rabin's assassination was not only in terms of what happened to many of us in Israel, but also it broke the trend that was beginning to develop. However, in the Middle East, memories are very, very historical. People remember, this is the one of the dominant traits of the Arab world, the Muslim world generally. And the memory of the days when Rabin really went out very much, he and his supporters went out to Arab countries and started some of the early moments of negotiation. It seems to me, and I'm a social historian, it seems to me that what we have been talking about in the last year is a continuation. There was a vacuum in between, but there was a continuation. And I think what's happened today under a totally different leadership in Israel and in the United States is very much a continuation of this particular event. Looking a little bit at the map, you can see on the one side, this is the picture of before the peace accord with Jordan. You can see Egypt here. The green is an ally. We didn't have allies before. The first ally was 1979. But to see what the map looks now and what I'll be talking about later, I think will indicate something very, very important. Sorry, I'll just go back one. If you look at this big map over here, this is the big wide world. You can just, if you look, I don't have to point out this is southern Sahara, which is part of a continuation of Morocco. I had to push it in because we'll be talking about this map earlier. So Morocco is friendly at the moment. Egypt is friendly. Sudan is friendly. Jordan is friendly. Saudi Arabia we'll talk about, and all those little other places. You can see the United Arab Emirates, Oman, places like that. They will all come up in terms of what we're going to be discussing. So here we get to the Abraham Accords. Abraham being the figure, the biblical figure, who's seen as one of the original Muslim figures as well. So that's really the idea of what we have there. So the picture we have with us in front is the famous picture that we had a short time ago, a few months ago, with standing next to the lady. We have the foreign minister of Bahrain, Abdullah bin Rashid. Then we have Bibi, we have Trump, and then we have the Abu Dhabi crown prince, who's really the most important person, Mohammed bin Zayed, who's really the person who pulled a lot of it together. What's the story of the Arab Emirates? Well, here we have to remember that if we look at our relationships with Arab countries, our two agreements before this present period were with Egypt and Jordan, who were enemies. And I always say, you know, it's a great deal easier to make peace with people who you have not fought with than people who you have fought with. So there's a tendency nowadays to say, well, this agreement, these agreements are much more important than with Egypt and Jordan because it won't be a cold peace. But I would say we have to remember something very important, and that is that essentially what we're finding now is a situation whereby we are making peace with countries who we haven't been at war with. So that's a whole lot easier. So what do the Arab Emirates want? The Arab Emirates want to be self-reliant. That's the most important thing. They want to be able to live in a way that they want. They themselves, as we'll see a little later, are a complex kind of formation. And what they want is self-reliance, which included until a week ago the idea that they were definitely going to get the F-35 aircraft, a very, very modern set of planes. President Biden is holding this on the sidelines. I imagine that they'll get them in the end, but he's looking at the military agreements with new eyes. But basically, even as those aircraft are not given to the Emirates immediately, I'm sure they will in the future, the knowledge that Israel has of modern military technology is vital for them. The Emirates are small country, minimal population. We'll look at some of those details a little later. So anyone who can really keep them stable, very wealthy country, it's very easy to knock out their oil and gas supplies. That would be no problem at all. And therefore, this sense of self-reliance and the need for self-reliance brings Israel very much into the picture. For many, many years, we've had relationship with them. Just a personal comment. I started lecturing at the Tel Aviv University in 1972. Before that, I was at the Hebrew University. 1972, I find myself at the Tel Aviv University and in the Middle East department, and everyone's talking about travel. So I'm kind of listening to these people in the lecturers' lounge, and I'm saying, well, where are you traveling? You're going to France, you're going to Britain. They say, we're going to other parts of the world. At that time, the code word for Israel, for Israelis, when they were going to some of the countries, and Arab Emirates were one of them, was to other parts of the world. I always say of Israeli secrets, in Israel, a secret is something that not everyone knows in the first 10 minutes. So information flow is very, very sort of kind of moves quickly in this kind of country. And certainly when one's in the kind of a certain academic or other realm of society, that you know about it. So this was already going on for a long time. And from 2015, they were already level diplomatic presence, Israel there in the Emirates as a kind of an not yet diplomatic level, but something a little on the lower level. As we mentioned earlier, Israel being an ally of America is important. And then we have at the moment something which is so crazy. The Beitar Yerushalayim soccer club is the most racist in the country. They have a policy over the years of not having Arab players. I mean, this is full speed racism. There's no other way of explaining what the club is about. And there's a story that one of the wealthy people from the Emirates is going to buy up 50% of the club. So it's crazy. I mean, it's something you'd never imagine. By the way, there's been a counter thesis of the last week that he's a crook. So the whole thing might not happen. But this whole idea of it's a changing world, this idea that a wealthy member of the Emirates would actually come and buy an Israeli right-wing racist club in itself speaks about a changing world. Let's look here a little bit at the Emirates. The Emirates, as far as most people are concerned, consist of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and then there are another 5 very, very small ones. The nature of the Emirates, and I think one of the most important statistics we have, is that only 12% of the population of those 7 Emirates are local people, are citizens. You have vast numbers of foreign workers. At the moment, the dominant foreign worker population is South Asian, but there were at other times people from different countries. So you've got the small elite group controlling the other 88%. What does that mean? That means there's always some sort of danger of unrest. Although many of the 88%, life is so good for them, they're loyal. I'm not saying the 88% are not loyal, but there's always some sort of danger when you've got a large non-citizen population in your country. We're talking about not just a 10 or 15%, we're talking here about the majority. Therefore, once again, when you look at it from the Emirates' position, they want reliable allies. And while America being a reliable ally is important, a close, reliable ally, someone who can actually, if necessary, really come in. I don't think Israel would ever want to be involved in a war, but come in and assist plays very much in Israel's favor. They have tremendously large oil and natural gas reserves, but they've been speaking about it for a long time. How long will it last? Iran is a major threat. We haven't got Iran on the map here, but you can see that you understand that Iran is just on the other side of the Gulf. That's constantly threatening and very important. And by the way, everything is changing in the Middle East. In the last few days, it seems that there's definite competition between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So there's economic tensions between the two countries. And Saudi Arabia, in the military sense, is not a very reliable place. Bahrain, where does Bahrain came in? I mean, most people, if they've heard of it, it's already quite unusual. Bahrain is a tiny, tiny little island, and they have their own sorrows. They have their own problems. Firstly, they're under 2 million, and the majority population is Shiites, and they controlled by 30% of the Sunnis. So you have something like you find in a number of countries. By the way, it's very much the Jordanian model. In Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom are a minority, and the majority population are Palestinians. So you have that similar kind of situation, a minority government. So you ask, why did Bahrain join in so very willingly? Once again, you want good friends. Your internal reality is possibly uncomfortable, and there have already been, as I mentioned there, constant attempts to overthrow the regime. They've already had a few cases like that. The army and the police are strong, but there's always that danger. So once again, an insecure part of the world looks at Israel as a very, very reliable ally. The Bahrain political structure is very much influenced by the Emirates. So when the Emirates were starting to talk to us, the Bahrainians moved in very, very quickly. They partners on all kind of levels. Their agreement with us is a lower level than the UAE, but it'll be upgraded. It's very interesting just to take two case studies of what's happened in the last few months to show how Bahrain really wants to be part of the picture. In November, 3 months ago, secret visits to Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, they weren't too secret, by the way, because the Palestinian population on the Temple Mount were wondering who these strangers were. And they clearly weren't the local crowd. They dressed differently, their dialect is different. So it got quite tense, and they had to actually move off the Temple Mount quite quickly. At a little after that, whereas they were having problem with the local Palestinian population, they were having good relations with the local Israeli population. And there were pictures of people from Bahrain and United Arab Emirates in Tel Aviv, in the middle of Tel Aviv. In fact, there was an amazing event where a young woman, she must have been in her late 20s, I think, who had actually learned Hebrew. She'd learned Hebrew in the last 2 years, and she was speaking to these young Israelis in Hebrew. You know, Israelis are a very kind of friendly crowd. The Tel Aviv crowd are a good crowd. And here you had this Bahrain and Emirate youngsters, people in the 20s and 30s, wandering around Tel Aviv very, very freely. And, you know, the Israelis were loving it. They were loving it. It was quite an experience. I mean, you know, when I spent so much of my life dealing with conflicts, just seeing people happy with each other is a wonderful situation. Our president, Rivlin, excellent president, by the way, he's come out again and again with very important statements. He was involved with in a conversation with the king there, Khalid bin Khalifa, and they were discussing kind of regular friendly discussions between the Israeli president and the king of Bahrain, just mentioning something which I think is important and an underpinning of where some of the problems lie. Just let me take the point. I mentioned a minute ago that on Temple Mount, the Palestinians were very aggressive to the people of Bahrain. And the people of Bahrain, the government of Bahrain, as most Arab countries, feels some responsibility to the Palestinians. Not that they always agree with the Palestinians, but they certainly feel some responsibility to them. So there has been discussion, ongoing discussions of, well, now we are getting on with the Israelis. The people of Bahrain feel responsible to the Palestinians. But you have to realize that the Palestinians aren't playing their cards very carefully. If they go up to Temple Mount, I mean, it would be very sensible for them to have done what exactly those Israeli Jews in Tel Aviv had done. Welcome them, be friends, and that's going to make the situation a little bit better. That didn't happen. President Trump granted the King Hamad bin Khalifa the Legion of Merit. By the way, I won't get involved in American politics of the last few days of triumph of Trump's ruling power, but there were a lot of awards being handed out to some of the Arab leaders. They loved it, by the way. In one case, we'll see with Morocco, there was an exchange of awards, which is a clever thing to do. Here we get into Morocco. Where's Morocco in this whole issue? Another story, totally different. One of Morocco's main problems is what you see on the map here, the Western Sahara area. The yellow is under Morocco. Morocco is the northern country. This is, some people would call it occupied territories. The Moroccans would call it liberated territories. So this area, the Moroccan army is in control of the yellow area, and the Polisario is a separatist movement, is the red, right next to Mauritania. The Polisario receives support from Algeria in the north, tremendous amount of support from Algeria. And Morocco's one of their main political goals at the moment is to take over the whole area of Western Sudan. So Morocco already had something at the back of their mind, and that's come to the fore more and more as time goes on. But Morocco has another component. There were a significant number, many hundreds of thousands of Jews, over 250,000 Jews lived in Morocco. It was only in the 1950s and 1960s that they started to leave. A long story, which we haven't got time to go into now. But what we know at that time is that although there were tensions between some of the Jews and some of the Moroccans, it's an ongoing discussion of how healthy the relations were. But there's no doubt about it, of the countries where Jews lived in Arab lands or in Muslim lands, Morocco was clearly one of the best case studies. And the various kings, Muhammad V, Muhammad VI, and Hassan II, all of them had very, very good relations with the Jewish population. So you already have a background, which obviously you don't have in the Emirates, where the Jewish population is very, very small. And Bahrain essentially has almost none, although they had a Jewish minister in the foreign affairs as a diplomat. But there's not a real Jewish issue which goes on with the Emirates or Bahrain. But in Morocco, there is a Jewish issue. And we have something on the third line here, which is totally unusual. We've never seen it before. That the Moroccan government has now stated that they will include Jewish history and culture to be part of the school curriculum. Very interesting phenomenon, which just shows how clearly the Moroccan government wants to be friendly with the Israelis. As I mentioned earlier, here we have the whole issue of Polisario and their battle with the Polisario, because the Polisario separatist movement gets very significant arms from Algeria. Morocco's always looking for some arms supplier. That certainly would come from the United States, but it's always good when you're dealing with new arms to have Israeli advisors. Israelis are on the spot. Israelis, deal with all the kind of weapons, much of the weaponry that the United States has. And so therefore, this is a military agreement as well as an agreement based on the land issue. President Trump awarded King Mohammed VI the Legion of Merit. And here comes something which is really quite fascinating. I mentioned earlier, and you people know it, that President Trump's relationship with the Muslim world was not particularly positive, particularly in terms of 5 particular countries where he didn't want to accept immigrants from them. He himself received the Order of Muhammad, the great Muhammad, the last and greatest of the prophets, the famous Muhammad. So here there was an exchange of titles, and it's significant. You know, in diplomacy, symbolic behavior is very significant. Here we have something which is symbolic behavior, but it's kind of represents a number of things, of which one is that Morocco clearly wants to be a close partner of the United States, and this is one way of showing it. 20 years ago, we had low-level diplomatic relations with Morocco. It's not yet at this stage a full diplomatic relationship, but it's moving very clearly to that. We see pretty much every few days there's some new relationship, and it's about trade, it's about finance, investment, and technology. Their plans for friendly games between national teams, soccer between these two countries is very, very important. Once again, I mention this because it comes up every single time that we see it, is they have stated very clearly that they support the Palestinian wishes. And just a few days ago, on January the 26th, at the Arab Union session, the Moroccan delegate at the Arab Union session made a very, very clear statement that we Moroccans are concerned with the Palestinians. However, I want to just emphasize the point that I've said before. Between the statement that they are really concerned and the actions that they show it, is we don't quite yet understand it, because the words are there, but the actions aren't there at the moment. And this is something, obviously, which one wants to follow up in the future. Now we go to something much more difficult. United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco, we all understand it. Sudan is another ball game, absolutely. Firstly, you can see I've had to sort of juggle the map of a divided Sudan over there. Sudan is essentially divided into three countries. Northern Sudan, which is often just called Sudan. Southern Sudan, which is a break-off region. The gap, by the way, is that some distance south of Khartoum, which is over there, around this more or less where the arrow is, you move from being an Arab country to an African country. So the former Sudan was very clearly divided ethnically between Arabs and Africans in the south. And that tension had been going on for a long time. When southern Sudan received its independence, the Darfur area, which is different tribes as compared with the tribes of southern Sudan, Darfur and southern Sudan went into a conflict situation. So let's look at it totally from the Sudanian position. Their history with Israel has been very problematic because in August 1967, one of the most important Arab declarations that have been made, at least from the Israeli perspective, August 67 is a few months after the Six-Day War. Israel has won the Six-Day War. Many Israelis, myself included, imagined that because we won the war, we'll be moving to a much better situation. They came out with the famous three no's. No peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. This was a very, very clear statement for a long time after the Six-Day War. It goes into the 70s and 80s, and into the 90s, you would see that the three no's once again comes up. What's happened with Sudan? What's really gone on there? So here we have to go back to our red. Here we have to go back to the United States. Sudan has been involved with a significant number of anti-Western activities, attacks on passenger planes, some very, very problematic issues as far as the West is concerned. And what really happened is that the Sudan had become a pariah had a pariah status. It was not accepted by pretty much any country of the world. Some of the Arab countries every now and again supported, but were always very suspicious. What's happened with this agreement, which is starting to develop, is firstly, as a result of the United States, Jared Kushner in particular, pushing this whole project, which we've been talking about till now, the decision of the United States to support a $1 billion annual loan from the World Bank, Northern Sudan, which is in a terrible economic situation, will then be able to get a very significant amount of money. Now, $1 billion dollar loan might not sound too significant to most of us, but in terms of national affairs, but in the economy that Sudan finds itself in, that is a very significant amount of money. So access to improvement in diplomacy, military assistance, relief assistance, and financial assistance makes it a big issue. There is one thing that we have to thank the Sudan government for, although it was very costly, was the assistance of getting Ethiopian Jews out in 1982. Very important venture, not easy, cost a lot of money, but that was how we managed to get a significant number of Ethiopians out and brought them to Israel. They're interested in normalization. And we come to the last point over here. Among the other things that the Sudan government is aware of is that a very significant part of their parliament, it's not a democracy, but there's a functioning parliament, but a very significant number of the parliamentarians are actually against the agreement with Israel. So here they're in attention, but as far as the government is concerned at the moment, it is worthwhile doing anything to become close partners with the United States as well as with Israel. Oman, little country down there south of Saudi Arabia, kind of one of those countries that seem to be pretty much at the end of the world. Oman was already visited in 1994 by Yitzhak Rabin. In 2018, Israeli ministers were going there. Transport minister and a sports minister went there to meet them. So there was already a precursor of what's going on. 2018, the prime minister and his wife, Sarah Netanyahu, went to visit and met, we can see the picture here, the former Sultan of Oman. He died a few months ago, but they spent a few days there. And once again, this word normalization. Normalization isn't quite peace, but it's a good step in view of it. The Oman government is much more specific than the Emirates, Bahrain, or Morocco, and says there will only be real normalization, there will only be real diplomatic contact as soon as the Palestinian state receives its capital in East Jerusalem, which from an Israeli political perspective isn't something that's expected to happen. Saudi Arabia is the big player. And for many, many years now, I remember being involved in speaking to Israeli audiences and saying years ago that we will be able to establish good relationships with Saudi Arabia. And you know, there's a strange Israeli trait. I've been here 53 years and it still amazes me. They would say, this is a startup creative country, but in politics, they say, "Ze lo yikre," it'll never happen. This concept that it will never happen. And years ago, it was pretty clear that a situation was going to improve with Saudi Arabia. So once again, this isn't overnight. With all the accord claim to Jared Kushner, there's a background to what was happening many, many years ago. Back and forth, people meeting these.
Paul, you're muted by accident. Can you unmute yourself? I'm sorry.
Okay, is it on now?
Yep, you're good. That was my fault.
Okay, fine. So here we see Netanyahu meeting the Crown Prince. He's called MBS, by the way. Everyone knows him as MBS because they weren't supposed to, no one was supposed to know. They met in a small town, but anyway, the word got out. So now what Saudis have done is allow Israeli planes to fly over Saudi airspace. That means we can get to China, to India, countries like that without going a long way around. So we're saving about 4 hours of flight time. It's interesting that they're using Bahrain for investments in Israel. You know, there's so much stuff that goes on in the world. Just let me make a comment as from an historical perspective. The knowledge is divided into what you know and what you don't know. And I would say in many cases, what one doesn't know is more important than what one does know. And this is one of those kind of situations. What we now know is that trade carries on between countries where you would imagine that it just wouldn't. The feeling as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned that MBS, because he's got serious problems with America and with President Biden, probably more so much more so than with President Trump, because of his probable involvement with the assassination of a Turkish journalist. There's a division within the Saudi administration. It's very much a closed family. It's a big family. It's about 5,000 people. But within that big family, there are different factions. And there was a former head of the intelligence who a few months ago put Israel into the apartheid state category, which obviously isn't the best language to get into diplomacy. And Mitchell Bard, who writes a great deal about these kind of issues, says that as far as he's concerned, the King Salman's long history of violent anti-Semitism is the major problem. So just let's try and imagine there's a good chance that we'll eventually establish relations with Saudi Arabia, but there's going to be internal issues which have to be worked out first. Now, I think my one has got frozen. No, it's okay, we're into it. Okay, sorry. Turkey. Turkey's a strange story. We've had terrible relationships with Turkey, as you in the United States. 2016, there was the Marmara conflict. There were a number of boats that were going to try and land illegally in Israel to bring in peace groups. They're clearly not intending to be particularly friendly. The Israeli soldiers got on this boat that you see, the Marmara boat there, and there was a tremendous conflict and people were killed. And it seemed that for all times, there was going to be no moving forward. December 2020, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, an Islamist, comes up with the idea that he wants to improve relations with Israel, pretty much out of the blue. That had really little understanding. What's the story? Nothing to do with Israel, by the way. Nothing to do with America. He's got problem with the Russians. Much of his air force and some of his army is supplied from Russia. The Russians aren't so keen to carry on supplying Turkey, and it's a whole mixed story because of what's going on in Syria. So it's one of those complex kind of international situations. So the Turks are in a bad situation. They're looking for new colleagues, new friends, and therefore they're hoping that becoming friendly with us will lead to improved relations with the United States and for their own interests. But just as we see at the bottom here, whenever I hear an Israeli official talking about Turkey, the suspicion is very high. Let's just go out for the fun to some other areas. Bhutan, a tiny little country over there, one of those isolated countries. You know, if you try and understand what Bhutan's all about, kind of there's not too much information available on any country. A very small country, under a million population. They only have foreign relations with 50 countries. And basically the story of Bhutan, I've actually been speaking to some people who spent time there. They are petrified of external influence. They want to keep Bhutan as they are. However, their top priority is agriculture. And the Israeli Foreign Ministry from years ago developed a program where before Israel became wealthy and a more technological country, one of our saleable commodities was agricultural know-how. For example, drip agriculture, just as one component. And the Mashav courses, Mashav is a section of the Foreign Ministry. The Mashav courses were open to several hundred people from Bhutan. That's a very significant number. That meant that once again, relations a long time ago, very important, very useful. And now that the fact that the world is slowly beginning to open up increasingly, together with the regular diplomatic contact, there's probably going to be a normalization of agriculture. Be it as it may, it's good news for both sides. Indonesia. If we think Turkey's a little bit crazy, what is going on with Indonesia? But we've only had a little bit of information on it, and at the moment it's talk only. And that's the CEO of the U.S. International Development Corporation stated once again a short time ago that Indonesia, which has, like many countries of the world, serious economic issues, could receive a $2 billion U.S. development aid if it recognizes Israel. By the way, I haven't found any confirmation of this, but once again, I think that the world is starting to change. The world is pragmatic. Israel's a partner. That's what I think this whole my whole presentation about. And we don't know how it always develops, but there are possibilities. The tragedy of the Palestinians. I want to quote here Victor Hatan from the University of Nottingham. He's a very, very strong pro-Palestinian. And I deliberately choose him, an article in Haaretz magazine, Haaretz newspaper, because he's an important voice as a supporter of the Palestinians, not anti-Palestinians, a deep supporter of the Palestinians. And he brought up in his article just a month and a half ago or so, a little less, a number of very important points on what's happening with the Palestinians generally. Firstly, he mentions about some of the Gulf states, some of which we've been speaking about. Empathy for the Palestinians appeared to have weakened. Now, many of the countries, by the way, particularly Qatar is a major supporter of the Palestinians, but except for Qatar, many of the Gulf Arab countries are not being very supported. The Palestinian leadership has focused on the West. They've kind of almost lost faith in the Arab world. That hasn't been very important. Younger generations of Arabs around the Arab world I don't remember the two intifadas, the two conflict events, and they really don't care anymore. And so Victor Katan points out that it is incumbent on the Palestinians to redouble their efforts to build a coalition and to find a way to sell their cause that appeals to the younger Arab generation. He makes here a very, very important point. He also says that by and large, young populations are not so pro-Israel, and certainly the young population of the Palestinians for understandable reasons. The other great loss was the January 2020 Trump plan, which although it suggested some kind of Palestinian state, it had some very, very problematic issues as well. And so they are the great losers. We're almost at the end, and hopefully there'll be some questions. The big picture. What are the big pictures? Just to summarize some of the points I've made here. I mentioned the Oslo Accords, 1993-94. That really put us onto the map. And then as a result of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination and other political issues, then those contacts were lost. Israeli secret services have been very active. Even at the moment, by the way, one of the top negotiators is the head of the Mossad. In the old days, we would never know who the head of the Mossad was. Things have changed now. We actually know. We know where he's going. We know who he's meeting. So things are much more above board than they were then in the past. Something which I think is absolutely vital in terms of understanding those of you who aren't so involved in global interaction, you should know that contacts carry on all the time. Israelis are big attenders of conferences. You go to any of the major conferences of the world, you'll always have a few excellent Israeli presenters there. And, you know, that's the frontal part. Behind the scene discussions have been carrying on for years and years and years. I know it personally, speaking to people from countries that we wouldn't expect, when you, in certain situations where you can sit down and have a friendly chat, the people from those other countries, I myself speaking to some Iranians, for example, was always very surprised to see how easily it is actually to speak to these people. We have to mention that much of what has happened at this time in history has because of the involvement of President Donald Trump and Jared Kushner. It's difficult to say this couldn't have happened otherwise. but the speed that it happened with and the tremendous willingness of the United States through Jared Kushner in particular to say, if you work together with Israel, you will be gaining because we will support you diplomatically and in terms of financial assistance is something which we just have to exist. And at the bottom, we've got a picture here, Trump looking one direction, President Biden the other one, and MBS in the middle. Basically, the picture indicates we will have to see exactly what is going to happen. To the very last slide. That picture, by the way, is outside the United Nations. And here, Dan Shapiro, the former American ambassador in Israel, there's a chance that he'll be reappointed now. He's been on Zoom, and he pretty much says exactly the same at every situation, every time. He says that as far as he's concerned, that President Biden will relate to Israel in exactly the same way. And what we've seen since President Biden came into power is that the American establishment has been very, very supportive so far. At the same time, whereas Donald Trump was not in any way concerned with a two-state solution, President Biden is very much concerned with this one. Several issues we're not quite sure of what different Arab countries are still going to do as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned. What will the role be of Israeli Arab Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel? Up till now, once again, they haven't been too positive about these issues, which I think has worked against them. And just to end off with what in this situation we cannot but quote, and that is in situations of such crisis. And here we're talking, by the way, of a 73-year-old country where if at any time in the last 50 or 60 years, I would present what I've been presenting now as a dream, as something that could happen, even those people who kind of would put themselves on the optimistic side would say, you're excessively dreaming. Your dreams have no value at all. But we know from biblical text, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. One translation.
Mr. Paul Liptz.
Goes to show this is an exciting, positive moment for us in Israel and for you in the United States. Okay, thank you.
You are incredible as always. You could use the words of Theodore Herzl too. Im tirtzu enzo agada. If you will it, it is no dream. Not just about building the state, but creating a safer state. Paul, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but I think Janet just said she has a ton of questions, and your email is always available, and you're very responsive, and people really enjoy that. So I appreciate your presence. You know, this is your home in America here at Shalom Aleph. We love you, and just know that our heart goes to you, and we hope to see you very, very soon in Jerusalem.